For a lot of survivors, if they knew what to look for, they could have potentially avoided becoming a victim. And what I mean by that is there are some things that I've recognized a lot of abusers have in common. Doesn't mean that they might not fall outside of these descriptions, but these are three of the top type of abusers that I've seen. I'm J20, a licensed psychotherapist, and I have over 10 years of experience helping people heal from unhealthy relationships. So as I mentioned, abusers can come in all shapes and sizes, colors, languages, right? There's just a lot of unhealthy people in the world. I would say I think there's more healthy people. Don't get me wrong, not trying to doom doom and gloom on the market out there as far as partners. But when I think about abusers and what they bring to the table, outside of power and control, which I think all three of these types will have in common, I wanted to highlight some three kind of traits or even life experiences to look for. And so the first one I would say is a history of trauma. And when you think about that, like if you are familiar with the Adverse Childhood Experiences study or the ACEs survey, then you probably are aware that a lot of people have experienced adversity and trauma in their life, especially when we think about childhood. So, one thing that I've seen a lot of abusers have in common is their childhood was not healthy, right? They might have experienced a lot of child abuse themselves. They might have seen their own mom or dad go through a DV situation multiple times. They could have seen their siblings go through unhealthy situations. So, a lot of times, this early exposure to trauma it essentially goes untreated. And because a person might not get treatment for that, maybe they couldn't access therapy because of resources, or if they're from a Black and Brown community, it could have been because of stigma, right, around seeking support or even talking about problems outside of the home. There's a lot of ways that early childhood adversity gets taken into adolescence and then later into adult life. And it shows up in their relationships, right? And so for a person that's never really been able to heal or, get the tools or the skills needed to heal from their trauma, they might take that out on their partner, right? And so in their relationship, that might be where the violence or the unhealthy tendencies come from, is that they are essentially an unhealed person. And because of that, they might not have the ability to self regulate, emotionally regulate. And so it comes out in these unhealthy ways. I think it can be difficult to, talk about that because some people might hear this as an excuse for their behavior and it's not. And I'll say that for all three of the types we're going to talk about today, where I think it doesn't really matter what their history is or what their experiences are. I think abuse is never okay. However, I do think there are factors that contribute to why the abuse happens, right? So for this instance, we're talking about early childhood trauma or even later in life. I've worked with clients where their partner had a great childhood, had both parents in the home, healthy family, good social economic background, and then something later in life happens, right? Either an accident or a traumatic situation where that shifts for them and they become abusive. And I will do a video about there's certain life experiences that just change people. And unfortunately, if they don't find a healthy way to cope with those changes, it turns into abuse in their relationships. So I think that's one type to look out for. And this might be challenging, right? Because you might meet a person and some people are very open and transparent, right, with their history, where they might immediately go into sharing about childhood traumas and adversities they've gone through. For other people, especially if we take a step back and think about males in America and how we're socialized not to necessarily share feelings or even to have feelings, right? That stuff might not come out. They might mask it. They might not have ever talked to anyone about it. And it doesn't mean that it's not there and that the impact isn't there, but it just might not be something that's disclosed to you, right? As the new partner or even a long term partner. So you might not always have that information readily available, but it is something to consider that if you do find out about a person's past or their history, it's something to consider. And it doesn't mean that if they do have a traumatic history or they do have a lot of adversity that they're not worthy of being a great partner. They are potentially, right? But I think it points to the question of how have they healed their inner wounds? How have they worked on their adversity? And what are the skills? What are the treatments? What are the therapies that they've been able to access or tap into? It could be spirituality, right? Some people never go to therapy. They never go see a professional, and that's fine. I'm not trying to say that that's the only way to heal, but the question is, how have they healed, right? And I think a lot of us have heard that saying that hurt people hurt people. And so these type of abusers, again, there's just a lot of trauma in their past. And unfortunately it goes untreated and they don't know how to handle the stressors of life. That's kind of what I've heard. That's the trend, right? Is they maybe they lose their job or even have a bad day on the job. Heck, they could lose a bet on a football game, right? It's just a stressor that they don't know how to emotionally regulate, and that stress spills over into their relationship. So a lot of times, again, this could be related to untreated trauma or adversity. The next type I would want to talk about now is sometimes, folks do have a habit. And what I mean by that is like a substance use habit. So they might be abusing some type of substance, whether it's alcohol, or illicit drugs or prescription drugs, right? There's a lot of different ways that people use substances. And there is, let me take a step back on this one. Substance use does not cause domestic violence. And I'll say it again. Substance use does not cause domestic violence, but it will amplify any type of unhealthy traits that are already present in a person. So another way you could think about this, there's a lot of substance users out there that are not abusive partners. And then there's a lot of abusive partners out there that are not substance users, right? So we know that it's not a direct correlation. Substance use does not cause domestic violence, but does it make things better? Usually, no. So if a person has challenges, controlling their emotions or coping with life stressors in a healthy way, if they start using substances, it's probably not going to make the situation better, right? So a lot of times that's another red flag for a partner if they have a substance use problem. Again, does it mean that they can't be a healthy partner? No, but it's a factor that could contribute to violence if it does start to show up in the relationship. And again, for a lot of people, that is how they learned to cope with life's stressors. And a question I always ask, when I'm doing trainings or working with students or even with clients, it's like, how do you know something is an unhealthy coping skill? If it leads to more problems down the road, it's probably an unhealthy way to cope with it, right? So for people that are struggling with life, and don't really know where to turn to. If they turn to substances, it's probably going to create more problems in their life, including relationship problems. So that's another type to look out for. Again, doesn't mean that someone's not worthy if they are struggling with substance abuse. No, they just might need some help. And until they get that help, it could have a challenging impact on the relationship. And the last type I would talk about now is mental health. So there's a lot of adults in America, a lot of adolescents where their mental health is not being treated, right? I mentioned earlier in Black and Brown communities and even in, Asian Pacific Islander communities, there is a lot of stigma with seeking mental health services. The cultural, aspect of mental health is very, very complex. Cultural responsiveness is huge. Folks that are able to find a provider that looks like them, that talks their language. It's not always accessible, but there's just a long history, right? I don't want to shy away from this. American history has not been favorable towards people of color. And so for a lot of folks, they do not trust the mental health field. Even when I've offered services to clients, I'm not crazy. I don't need to talk to you. Like there's this clear historical kind of narrative around mental health services. And so for a lot of folks, that come from these type of communities, they might not go talk to a professional. There might be shame involved with that within their family system, right? They might tell their brother, hey, I'm thinking about going to talk to a therapist. Why would you do that? That's weak. That's fill in the blank, right? Lots of language that I'm not going to use that I've heard folks say their family responded, right? When they told them that they wanted to go see a therapist. So when you think about unhealthy individuals in relationships, a lot of times that might be what's going on. They might be, just dealing with mental health challenges, maybe their whole life that they've never gotten treatment for. And so again, going back to stress management in the relationship, they don't know how to handle it all. And so it comes out in these unhealthy ways. And of course, there is a spectrum of mental health, right? Are we talking about severe mental illness, where someone's dealing with psychosis? Okay, that can be an unsafe partner, right? And I've helped a lot of clients where that is the case, whether it's, their partner's diagnosed with schizophrenia or bipolar, or, they might have a personality disorder. Like there's a lot of mental health cases where it can be difficult, not impossible, but it can be difficult to have a healthy relationship. So something I want to conceptualize, as I kind of tie these three together, if you think about a person that maybe they went through adversity in their childhood, never got treated for it, so they turned to substance use to cope with it, and that substance use on top of what they've experienced in life, manifests as a mental health disorder. That's a pretty typical case out there, right? Where there's a male that has struggled with mental health, never got help for it, has always used substances to cope with it, but also went through a lot of things in his childhood. That person, that man, that female, they're out there. Again, doesn't mean they can't be a healthy partner. Not what I'm saying. But is there a lot of inner work to be done for them to be a healthy partner? Yes. So these are characteristics to look out for. These are lived experiences to pay attention to. And it's your choice, right? Everybody has a choice. You can definitely try to work it out with a person that has that lived experience, but just know sometimes those are the factors that lead to violence in the relationship. It's this person trying to work out their healing. And some people are not really open to healing, just to be real with you. Some people feel like life is what it is and I'm not going to try to work on it. I'm just going to deal with it the way I deal with it. And I deal with it with rage. That person is also out there. So hopefully you got some insight out of this and we'll continue on this journey of safety. Please check out the support and resources. And again, stay safe if you are going to plan to leave your partner. And I just hope that you continue to find insight and have these conversations with your loved ones because you could hopefully, prevent them from falling into these situations. Talk to you soon. Stay safe.